Yeah, we do.
Good afternoon. My name is Gordon Mikoski, and I'm part of the Science and Faith Committee at Pennington Presbyterian Church, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to an event related to science and faith. We received several years ago a grant from the Templeton Foundation to talk about science in congregations. And we did a series of events, and then COVID, and now we're into a new phase. And this is the first event in the next phase of our work on science and faith. There will be further events in 2026. We hope to do 2 of those events. If you're interested in those conversations, let us know. And we're also interested in topics that you find interesting that we could pursue. But today, it's my privilege to introduce our speaker. But before I do that, let us begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. O God of creation and new creation, we thank you for making us to be creatures of wonder and complexity. We thank you also for healing us when we become ill and need help in body, mind, or soul. We pray that your healing spirit would move among us this day and help us to receive your restorative touch, that we in turn might be agents of healing for others. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. So today, we have the privilege of hearing from the Reverend Miriam Deephouse McMillan, who grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and graduated from Calvin College in 2007, and then Princeton Seminary, where I teach, in 2010. She's an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, and a chaplain at the Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, where she's been for over 12 years. And she's a board-certified chaplain with additional specialization in dialectical behavioral therapy. And with her husband, Phil, who is the music person leader at Pennington Presbyterian. They are the parents of Caleb and Hazel. And she's the author of Sacred Balance, How Ancient Practices Can Restore Modern Minds, which was published last year. We are very happy to have you here with us, Miriam, and we look forward to all that you'll share. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. We can go to the first slide here. So, obviously I'm here to talk about research about spirituality and mental health, but I always find it helpful to know the context. The research that's out there now has a history behind it. So I want to share just a little bit about that history before we dive into what we're actually learning from the contemporary research. So, can we get the next slide up? Perfect. So, the fields of spirituality and psychology are inherently related. The root words here that I have up, spiritus and psyche. Spiritus is a Latin word that means spirit or soul. And psyche is the Greek word that psychology and psychiatry are built on. And that is a Greek word that means mind or soul. So as we know when we're translating from one language to another, there's not a one-to-one correlation, right? But there's some overlap. So this concept of a soul, of the part of us that's unique, that makes us who we are, the core of our being, is something that both these fields have always been interested in, right? What makes us who we are and how do we work on that? The actual history of psychology is only about 150 years old. There isn't a lot there in the grand scheme of human history. So that doesn't mean that mental health is only 150 years old. People have always tried to figure out, what do I do when I'm struggling with my thoughts, with my emotions, with something that's going on in my mind? So where was that happening previously? It was happening in religions, right? Faith traditions were the place that people went when they were struggling, to get advice, to get counseling, to get support. And so spirituality has this wonderful history. But when the field of psychology started, it was part of the modern age. It was trying to prove itself as a hard science. And in so doing, there was an intentional distancing from spirituality and from religion that happened. And in return, a lot of faith communities, especially in the West, in the United States, saw that as threatening and then kind of demonized the science, demonized psychology, and said, oh, you can't be a Christian if you listen to the psychiatrist and what they say. And so we had this conflicting relationship that developed early on. But then about 40 years ago or so, maybe 50 years ago, but in the past 40 years for sure, the science, the people in the psychological field started doing research that had very spiritual themes. There are fields of psychology that use a lot of spiritual words, like gratitude, like compassion, right? These are things that have been part of faith traditions for a very long time. And now the sciences are saying, oh, I wonder what that's really about. Can we study that, right? How can we learn from that? And so there's a coming back together that's happening, and there's an inclusion of spirituality in the mental health field. There's a lot of research now that's showing how important faith and spirituality are in a person's process of recovery and coping with all sorts of things, mental illness being one of them. And I wanted to make a note about the history of psychotherapy itself. Even though there was this distancing from religion, there were always some moral and spiritual elements that were included in psychology and in psychiatry. There is a branch of therapy. The hospital where I work, Trenton Psychiatric Hospital, was founded in what the framework of moral therapy, meaning that if we treat people morally, if we give them a serene environment and have compassion for them, that will help them to recover. And that came out of spiritual traditions that were saying, hey, if we show love and compassion to people, it's good for them. It will help them get better. And so there were these elements that were always kind of woven into psychology. And I actually found one article that traced a lot of the key theorists in psychology and their own spiritual backgrounds. And a lot of them were either subtly incorporating or reacting against the faith traditions that they were raised in. So Freud is very famously atheistic, but he was raised in a Hasidic Jewish household and had a nanny who was very strongly Catholic. And so there's some question of, was he, maybe reacting against some of that? And some theorists have even said that there are elements of the sort of mystical trends of Judaism, the Kabbalah strand of Judaism, in Freud's theories. So even though he may be reacting against it, it's a little bit in there still. Carl Jung was actually a Reformed pastor. He was a Swiss Reformed pastor, and he became one of the founders of psychology, the Jungian tradition. And he's very focused on this sort of search for meaning and finding understanding of what we're psychologically experiencing. And that comes from some of his spiritual training and finding meaning in faith. Viktor Frankl, very well-known Jewish psychologist, survived the Holocaust and developed his whole frame of therapy based in the importance of finding meaning in our experience. So he named his theory logotherapy, and that comes from another Greek word, logos, which if you're familiar with Christian scripture, the word logos is the same word that's used in the New Testament for the Word of God. So this idea of word, of meaning, of significance is woven through both traditions again. Carl Rogers, another famous psychology person, person-centered therapy, if you just give people a healthy environment and support, they have what they need to grow. He actually attended seminary before he went to school for psychology as well, and so integrating that into his trainings as well. So, you could argue whether they were spiritual in nature, but it's clear that these threads have been woven together throughout the history of psychology and spirituality, and now I think the fields are kind of understanding each other a little bit more. And I would say, if anything, the mental health world is more open to spirituality than a lot of churches are open to the mental health world. That may be changing, but that's something that I'm very passionate about because we have this wonderful history. We have thousands of years of wisdom and traditions that we can use to help people. We know it helps us. That's why we're here. That's why we're part of these traditions. And so can we own that? Can we share that? And can that be something that we lift up as part of our tradition? So that's hopefully what we'll start a little bit today. Take a look at the next slide. This is just a graph of a bunch of different treatment modalities in the mental health world right now that have explicitly spiritual elements in them. So I'm not going to list them all off, but all of these different types of therapy that are being used in the field today are explicitly drawing from spiritual traditions and even integrating spiritual concepts in their therapy. So that's where the field is today, and so there's a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of review the research and figure out how can we understand the role that spirituality is playing in our mental health. All right, so we're going to dig into the research a little bit now. At the next slide. The first area where a lot of the research is being done is in the field of coping. In the mental health world, there is an understanding that there is not a cure for mental illness. We call it the recovery model. Recovery is the idea that we learn to live with our symptoms. We learn to cope. We learn to live our lives the best way we can with the limitations that we may have. And so there's this idea that we need coping skills. We need things that help us with that process. And so there is a researcher, he's an emeritus professor from Bowling Green University, Kenneth Pargament, who's been for about 30 or 40 years, I think he started in the 90s, so 30-some years, has been studying the role of religion in coping. And some of that has been exclusively coping with mental illness, but it also includes things like coping with physical illness. If you've heard some of the popular headlines about prayer helping people recover after surgery, some of his research is involved in some of those. And in that process, in his research, he developed an instrument, an assessment tool for assessing how someone is using religion in coping. So he's using a scientific tool to assess how someone is coping. And he kind of separates things into positive coping and negative coping. So this is a quote from one of his articles, that positive religious coping activities reflect a secure relationship with God, a belief that there is greater meaning to be found, and a sense of spiritual connectedness with others. While negative religious coping, on the other hand, reflects an ominous view of the world and a religious struggle to find and conserve significance. So this is a useful framework. I've used it as a chaplain in what we call spiritual assessment. When I talk with a patient and I see where are they in their spiritual journey, are they feeling connected? Are they finding meaning in their faith? Or is their faith a source of disconnection and confusion in their life? And that can be a helpful way to think about how we want to use our faith, how we want to engage our spirituality. And I will get there towards the end when I talk a little bit more about what does this mean for us. But it's helpful to know how it's being talked about in the scientific field. One of the other points that Pargament discovered in his research that I think is really interesting is that religious behaviors, things like going to church a certain number of times, were less significant in positive coping results than how someone engaged their faith in a moment of stress. So it's less about the external behaviors and more about the internal process of how am I using faith to make meaning of this experience? How am I personally connecting with God as a source of support, or connecting with my faith community as a source of support? So it's less about numbers and observable behaviors and more about that internal coping. And he calls it the difference between active and passive coping. So active coping being I'm actively searching for answers in my faith. Passive coping would be I'm sitting in a pew waiting for the answer to come to me. Right? So we're looking for that active coping role. And then another researcher, Kenneth Kendler, studies genetic research around depression, among other things, and mental health risks in general, so like genetic risks for different mental illnesses. And so he looked at a correlation between spirituality and lifetime risk for particular mental illnesses. And he found something very similar to what Pargament found, that intrinsic motivation, people who identify faith as personally important to them and are using it in their lives, have less of a risk of mental illness compared to what he calls authoritarian or conservative religious views, which is, I have to follow these rules, otherwise I'm damned to hell. So that is less helpful in reducing risk for mental illness than having a personal positive engagement with God and with your faith. And then he also highlighted that the communal aspect of religion is one of the things that reduces risk. It's a protective factor against risk for mental illness, to be a part of a faith community. So I think that's also a really important point for us to be aware of as we think about what our churches can do, what our communities can do to support people with mental illness, is that just being a part of a community in and of itself is really powerful. So we have a lot more to get through, but I want to pause to see if there's any questions or discussion about this aspect of coping and the research around spirituality and coping. If not, we will move on. Leanne.
Well, just, thank you. Could you say just a tiny bit more about the extent to which spirituality is helping at a place like Trenton Site to help people heal and cope and recover?
I think it's very individual. I can't give you, it's 30% more effective. I don't have those numbers. I think some of Pargament's research might have some more like comparative numbers. I'm less of a numbers person, but I can think of specific examples where I've seen really strong impact in people's ability to cope. And it doesn't mean that it solves all their problems, but that it's really effective in the moment. So there's one particular patient that I can think of who has a very severe mental illness, schizophrenia, very delusional, had beliefs that people were stealing parts of her body, but she was very religious. And she would be on the unit yelling, screaming, terrified because she believed, these things were happening to her. And as soon as a chaplain walks on the unit, she says, "Oh, hello, chaplain, will you pray with me?" As calm as can be, right? Like it was just like a light switch. Does that mean now she didn't go and start yelling again the minute I left? Probably not. But in that moment, her spiritual engagement was very positive. So it's more of that individual engagement piece than an overall how effective is it, if that makes sense.
So because you have the word recovery up there, that ran into addiction,
Mm-hmm.
and so I'm curious you were saying about how faith and knowledge is part of AA, there's a faith kind of loosely defined faith component, but could you say something about how faith plays into addiction?
And repeat the question.
Yes, thank you for the reminder. So the question is, using the word recovery brings to mind AA and other 12-step type programs and how spirituality is involved in some of those. It definitely, the traditional 12-step model is explicitly religious. One of the steps involves, believing in a higher power. There has been some movement away from that because for people who have painful religious experiences, that can be traumatizing, and so trying to allow access for people for whom that language is not helpful. There's other traditions, but there is some studies about, I want to say it was Kendler actually, who had some studies about the value of spirituality and that communal aspect being really helpful in recovery from addiction. Thank you for the question, great question. Anything else on the coping side of things before we dig into some neuroscience? All right, let's do it. Next slide, please. So this is where we get into the actual brain imaging, and I do have some fun little diagrams to show in a little bit. We now have the technology to scan people's brains and see what's happening when they do different activities. And there are a few researchers who've decided that what they want to look at is what happens in someone's brain when they're praying, when they're engaging in spiritual experiences. It's fascinating. So they have brain scans of which areas of the brain light up when someone is praying. There is a book that I have here. It came out in about 2009, 2010 called How God Changes Your Brain by Andrew Newberg, who is a physician, a medical physician and a neuroscience researcher at Jefferson Hospital down in Philly. And he coined the term neurotheology, which he says is the study of what happens in the brain when you engage in spiritual experience. So he has done a lot of really cool studies. He has scanned the brains of Buddhist monks and Catholic nuns while they are engaging in meditation and prayer to see which parts of the brain light up. And so he can point out, this is the part of your brain that lights up, or these connections. The brain is very complex. It's not just one, it's not like this spot right here is your spirituality spot. It's like which connections, which parts of the brain are active. He did some studies, some long-term studies, where he scanned people's brains and then had them engage in long-term meditation practices and scan their brains afterwards, and found that there is increased thickness in the frontal lobe. I'm not a huge neuroscientist, but I know that the frontal lobe is involved in decision-making, empathy, right? Being able to think through decisions, meaning-making, right? And so that's the part of the brain that gets thickened by prayer and meditation. And they can actually show it on a brain scan. So there is a sense in which we can use spiritual practices as a form of brain exercise, right? He actually, in the book, uses the imagery of lifting weights, right? The more you do it, the bigger the muscle gets. The brain can be the same way. The more you engage certain networks in your brain, the stronger they get. And we can see which networks those are. He did a study of people who went on a week-long Ignatian prayer retreat. St. Ignatius was a Jesuit leader who wrote a book about spiritual development that's still used today. One of the practices in my book is based on St. Ignatius's work. And that's still used. It's very common in Catholic traditions, but it's common in all branches of spiritual direction. And so Newberg scanned the brains of these people and then sent them on a week-long retreat doing Ignatian prayer practices, exactly the same kind of practices that I talk about in my book, and then scanned their brains again afterwards. And he was able to see the areas that were more activated, and they were related to self-awareness, having a positive or hopeful outlook, and then less connectivity in areas of negative or painful emotions. And that exactly lined up with what the participants said their own experience was, right? That they felt more connected to other people, they felt less anxious, right? They had less negative emotions and more sense of connection and self-awareness. And they can actually see what that looks like in the brain. In the book, How God Changes Your Brain, Newberg also talks about doing scans of people's brains while they envisioned God, picturing God in their mind. And he divided up different types of images of God to see what people's brains did differently depending on how they envisioned God. And so people who had a very authoritarian view of God, God is this judge who says you have to do the right things, otherwise you go to hell, it lit up areas related to fear and stress response, which makes sense, right? If you feel like someone's judging you, you're going to be afraid, you're going to have a stress response. People who had a more compassionate and sort of loving understanding of God, when they imagined God, it lit up areas of compassion and empathy in the brain, right? And we know that experiencing empathy and compassion helps light up our brain in that way so that we can then show empathy and compassion to others. And he could see this in these brain scans. And in the book, he has a list of all these things that are really good for your brain. Things like smiling, laughing, yawning, physical exercise, things we've heard, we know these things are good for our brain. He says the number one thing for your brain is faith. He defines that very broadly as optimism or sort of a positive outlook. But I thought that was pretty impressive for a neuroscientist to say faith is the best thing you could do for your brain. And I think we could own that, right? As people of faith, that's something that we should be really excited about. I think I had a slide. Yes, this is one of his slides. This is the Ignatian Retreat brain scan. So he was looking at brain connectivity. So the blue areas, I believe, are increased connectivity, and the red areas are decreased connectivity. And I cannot tell you the names of any of those parts of the brain, but I can tell you what they said about it, which is what I shared about self-awareness, compassion being increased, and negative emotions being decreased. But that they can pinpoint where that's happening in the brain is really fascinating. There is another neuroscientist. Her name is Sarah Lazar, and she works out of Harvard and Mass General Hospital. And she is particularly interested in brain scans around mindfulness. Mindfulness is kind of a key word these days about present moment awareness. It's drawn from Buddhist traditions, but the practices have some overlap with contemplative prayer in other traditions, including the Christian contemplative tradition that I write about in the book. And so she does brain scans in the same way. She'll scan somebody's brain and then have them engage in a mindfulness practice or an 8-week training in mindfulness, and then scan the brain again. And she was able to see areas where there is an increase in gray matter. So again, that idea of physically changing the brain, increasing areas of the brain. And she found that they were in places that correlate with the development of neurotransmitters, those chemicals that affect our mood, which are very important when we think about mental illness. A lot of medications for depression and anxiety affect neurotransmitters. And mindfulness affects the same part of the brain where those neurotransmitters are. So we'll take a look. It'll be 2 slides from here, the next one after this. So these little yellow spots are the parts of the brain that showed increased gray matter after an 8-week mindfulness training, that they could actually see this part of the brain is thicker. Lazar's theory is that the way mindfulness works is through attention. Mindfulness is all about noticing things, right? Being in the present moment, being aware of what you're thinking about. And that choosing what we focus on and how we react to it is what strengthens these parts of the brain. And she relates it to the idea of cognitive flexibility. We don't have to react the same way to things if we can be more aware, right? That we can develop more flexibility and have different ways to respond when we have built up these parts of our brain that give us a less automatic response and more of an awareness. And then what I think is really interesting is that she did a meta-analysis, meaning she looked at a whole bunch of different studies about mindfulness and said that overall, mindfulness does have a positive impact for people who struggle with depression and anxiety, but it's not like 100%, right? It's not like it fixes these problems. It has a little bit of impact. And what we know about spirituality is that spirituality has practices similar to this that can help, but spirituality also can give us community. It can give us meaning making. It can give us a sense that we're not alone. And all of those things individually are helpful. And so when we add all of these different protective factors together, we get a more positive response. So if we're trying to work on finding more mental wellness in our lives, or we're trying to support somebody who has a more serious mental illness, knowing that we can give them specific practices that can change their brain, but we can also give them community. We can also give them a space to make meaning and to understand their experience in that way. It can be really positive. And then the last one, if we can go back 2 slides again, there is a researcher at Columbia University, Lisa Miller, who wrote this wonderful book, The Awakened Brain. It's, I think, within the last couple of years that it came out. And she is a clinical psychologist who was looking at specifically the risk for depression and how that relates to spirituality. And she did a study of people who are at genetic risk for depression. So people who have depression in their family. We know that there are genetic components to most mental illnesses, and depression is one of them. And she was able to see that for people who are at the most risk, spirituality strengthens the area of their brain that would otherwise be diminished in depression. The same networks in the brain that get thinner for people who are depressed are thickened by those who identify as spiritual, or who identify spirituality as important in their life. So we're going to jump to her slide, which I think is 3 slides up from here. Should be slide 7. So it's a little hard to understand. So the different colors are the different parts of the brain. And you'll see that on each graph, there is 2 bars on the left and 2 bars on the right. The ones on the left are people who are at low risk for depression. So just everyday people who don't have a particular risk for depression. And for those people, there's less of a correlation. So the white bar is higher than the black bar. But for people who are at high risk, there is more of a correlation in the growth of white matter. And so Miller interprets this to say that it's not that spirituality fixes depression, but that active engagement with spirituality helps buffer the impact of depression. So people who are at risk for depression can use spirituality as a tool to help keep their brain protected. It does not prevent first experiences of depression, but it can diminish further experiences depending on how someone's using it. And Miller also studies family dynamics because she's studying this genetic risk for depression. And so she did a study looking at families where there was a mother and a child, and whether the mother identified as spiritual and whether the child identified as spiritual. And she said in the families where the mother and child both identify as spiritual, there is a stronger protective factor against the risk for depression. So sharing faith within our families and having models of how we use our faith is a part of that protective factor, which I think is also really important when we think about our faith communities and our community at large, and how do we help young people learn to use faith in a productive way against whatever mental illness they may be struggling with. What else does Miller say? Oh, she has another study about stress response, and this will be the next slide after this one. That the brain areas that light up when someone is stressed are decreased in people who identify spirituality as high. So the brain markers for stress are the numbers along the bottom, and the intrinsic spirituality is the numbers going up the side. And you can see that the dots form like a negative line. So it's a negative correlation. So people who identify spirituality as more important have lower markers of stress in these certain areas of the brain. And she has the different brain maps to show you where that is. But again, it's this idea of using spirituality as a protective factor and as an active tool, a coping tool, against stress and against the negative mental health impacts of stress. She lists a couple areas of the brain that are involved in this process in her description of kind of how it works. One is called the default network, the default mode network in the brain, and that is the system in the brain that is tied to rumination. So people with anxiety and depression, when you get that thought that's stuck in your head and it goes over and over and over again, spirituality is negatively correlated with that, right? That engaging in spiritual practices, feeling connected with God, can turn that rumination off to a degree. She also discusses the ventral attention network, which is the part of our brain that allows us to be open to new experiences and new insights. So when we're more aware of the world around us, we're more open, it helps us connect in different ways. That helps with creativity. So spirituality also helps us be more open and more creative in that way. And then the frontotemporal network is related to relational bonding, connecting with others. So all the things we said earlier about the importance of community, right? And hear a lot about mirror neurons, right? And the way that we respond to other people. And so that part of our brain is also activated by spiritual practices. And then what's deactivated is the parietal lobe, which has to do with our sense of self as distinct from the other. So it's what separates me from everybody else. And so that sense of separation is decreased by spiritual practices. So when you hear people who have a really meaningful, powerful spiritual experience, and they say, I just felt like I was connected to the universe, that's this decrease in this parietal lobe activity. So those are some of the key brain areas that she highlights as involved in how spiritual practices do what they do, why they do what they do in our brains. She has also some interesting pieces about brain waves. I don't really totally understand brain waves, so I'm not going to get into it, but there's something about alpha brain waves that is related to empathy and compassion and also like oneness with the universe, and that's somehow involved in spiritual practices. So if you want to know more about that, read the book and maybe go study brainwaves. I don't know much about it. So that is a really quick overview of a whole bunch of neuroscience. So I'm going to pause again if there are any questions about this neuroscience before I get into one more piece of the research.
In Miller's study where, I think was the last slide, where she studied the growth of, was it white matter or gray matter in the brain?
Gray matter.
Of gray matter in the brain for people genetically predisposed to have depression. Did she find that those levels were higher than individuals that did not, that were not predisposed to depression?
Yes. Yeah, which is really interesting. Right? And so her theory behind that is that the experience of stress, the experience of depression causes people to look for coping strategies or causes people. It's hard with all these studies because they're correlation, they're not causation. So they can't say that engaging in this caused someone to be more spiritual or vice versa. But her theory is that it's when people are using spirituality to cope with something really difficult, that's when you grow those brain areas.
I'm curious how the chaplain works with the therapist on a person, and if they're kind of parallel or if it's more a team approach. And I'm wondering if with more of these studies and findings, do you think it'll become more a team in the future?
I'm laughing because two of my psychology colleagues are sitting right behind you. The question is about how chaplains and psychologists work together in the field to work with patients in this way. And it's very collaborative in my experience. Obviously, there may still be people who come from that conflicting point of view who kind of don't trust spirituality, but I've actually been very surprised and pleasantly involved in team work with patients. The mental health field, especially for really acute mental illness, is always a team approach. It's never just one doctor treating, it's a whole team. And so chaplains are considered a part of that team and are welcomed into the team. And there may be patients for whom talking to a psychologist doesn't work. To a chaplain instead. And we have to be clear, I'm not a trained psychologist, right? I don't have the same training, but can I come at it from a different perspective and work with the team in that way? Any other questions about the neuroscience? If not, there is one more research area that I want to talk about, which should be the next slide. And this comes from research around trauma. Trauma response is a really important field of study in mental health because so many mental illnesses are exacerbated by trauma or even started by trauma. So somebody who has a risk for schizophrenia, if they experience trauma, they're much more likely to then go on and develop schizophrenia. And so trauma research is really important in this field. And increasingly, they're learning that trauma is not just a brain experience. It is a full body experience. If you've heard of books like The Body Keeps the Score, they come from this range of study, one of which is polyvagal theory. So there is a doctor, Stephen Porges, who writes a lot about polyvagal theory. This is the one I have. He has like 5 or 6 different books about it. And this comes from the idea of the vagus nerve, which is, the word vagus means wandering. So it's a nerve that wanders throughout our body. It starts in the brainstem, and it connects to all of our major senses and all of our major systems, including things like digestion, heart rate, breathing, circulation, all of that. And what they've learned is this is part of the autonomous nervous system, the part of our body that responds and does things that we're not consciously aware of, right? We're all breathing every day. Thank goodness we have an autonomous nervous system to keep that going when we're not thinking about it, right? Our heart is always beating. And that autonomous nervous system is also related to what most of us have heard as the fight or flight response and the rest and digest response. Polyvagal theory has sort of broken down those two categories. You'll see there's actually 3 bubbles on this little chart, that it's actually more complex than that. But the idea is that we have different states depending on our assessment of threat or safety in our environment. And it's our nervous system, mostly our unconscious nervous system, that is assessing for threat or safety at any given time and sending signals through this vagus nerve to tell all of our different body systems to change, depending on how safe or unsafe we feel. So the main addition that you'll see, relaxed would be like that rest and digest state. Mobilized would be fight or flight, and then a separate category of immobilized, which is known as the freeze response or sometimes the fawning response. And then you'll see there's overlapping pieces where sometimes different activities will have different combinations of those states of mind. But the idea is that the vagus nerve is kind of like a toggle switch. It's what tells all of our systems in our body to go from one state to another. So if you imagine you're laying on the couch watching TV, and all of a sudden you hear a terribly loud noise, what happens in your body, right? You jump up physically, your heart rate goes really, really fast, you start breathing faster, you might feel warm. They've done studies that the pitch of what you can hear changes based on which state you're in. So you hear, I believe it's lower noises, like the sounds of like an animal running or something is what you're more tuned to when you're in a stress state, and higher tones are when you're more relaxed. And they've done this with almost all of your different sensory systems, and your different bodily systems have some sort of a change that happens when you go from that rest state to that activated state. And so trauma and the response to trauma involves being in that activated state all the time, or sometimes even in the immobilized, that frozen state all the time, and not being able to get back to that sense of safety in that resting state. So what they've learned about that was kind of like, okay, we know that, so what do we do about it, right? How do we help people get into that more safe state? And a lot of the discussion is going back to the idea of co-regulation, which is, I talked before about that idea of mirror neurons, right? The way that our body responds to someone else's body. So the way that we can find a state of rest is often by being around somebody else who is calm and regulated. If you think about children, this makes a lot of sense, right? When a child is having a tantrum, if the parent is also really escalated, that tantrum's just going to keep escalating, right? This happens in my house a lot. But if I can keep myself calm, it doesn't mean that that tantrum's going to end immediately, but it's going to end a lot faster than if I escalate myself, right? So when we regulate our own nervous system, it helps other people to regulate. And so the idea of being in community as a form of finding safety. There's also some cool research around things like dance and music and how that relates to our vagus nerve and our sense of calm. There are studies about humming, just humming with people in a circle activates our polyvagal system in a way that helps us find calm. So when we think about faith practices, right? We gather together, we worship, we sing together. In some traditions, we dance. We Presbyterians, maybe not so good at the dancing, but but maybe we should, right? If it's going to help our nervous systems, maybe we could dance together a little bit more, right? Being calm in our bodies together is very healing for everyone. And then another piece about co-regulation is the sense of acceptance, of coming into a community where you're not being judged. Because a sense of judgment from other people activates the nervous system into that fight or flight response again. And so as a community of faith, can we find ways to signal to people that we are a safe place, that we are a place of non-judgment and of acceptance, and that we can co-regulate together in that way. And then routines is another piece of it as well, that the reason routines exist is because it gives our brain a break, right? If I had to think about how to brush my teeth every single day, that would take a lot of brain energy. And so we develop routines as a way to kind of give our brains a break from things. And so certain spiritual practices that may feel routine can be very soothing, right? We know this from the study of neurodivergence and the idea of stimming, right? Practices that are repetitive are very soothing to people on the autism spectrum. And so there are also ways in which many of us benefit from routine. Some of us like it more than others, right? Everybody is going to respond a little bit differently to all these things, but these are tools that we can have in our faith communities and in our faith practices that can help us consciously find that sense of safety and kind of de-escalate ourselves when we need to. So I want to practice this together with a little spiritual practice. So we'll go on to our next slide. We are going to do a breath prayer together, and I will lead you through this. And the reason I picked this one is because it has a very strong spiritual component and a very well-evidenced science-based component. Saying take a deep breath is generally accepted as a good idea when somebody's stressed out. I say it to my children so much that when they see me stressed out, sometimes they say, "Mommy, do you need to take a deep breath?" Hurts a little bit, but it's true, right? When I'm dysregulated, I need to take a deep breath. So we know on some deep level that breathing is really helpful for regulating our emotions and our thoughts. And from the spiritual side of things, breath has historically always been associated with God's Spirit. In the creation story, in the book of Genesis, the word ruach is the Hebrew word for spirit. It also means breath. And it is also the word when God breathes life into Adam and Eve. It's ruach, it's breath, it's spirit. And we see throughout Scripture this idea of breathing and spirit are connected. The story of Pentecost, right? The Holy Spirit blows in like a mighty wind, right? It breathes on people. And we have hymns that reflect on this, right? Breathe on me, breath of God, right? This connection between breath and spirit has historically been a part of our faith tradition, and it's also a part of what we know is good for our mental well-being. And breath is the only part of our autonomous nervous system that we can also consciously control, right? We cannot consciously change our heart rate. We cannot consciously change our temperature. But when we are aware of our breath, we can change it. That's why take a deep breath is possible, right? You can choose to take a deep breath. And so it is like a little button to access that system, that toggle switch, to calm ourselves down. And when we do it with awareness of God's Spirit, we're also getting that sense of connection, that sense of support, that sense of meaning, that I'm not alone in whatever I'm dealing with right now. So it is one of the most powerful spiritual practices. It's also a really common mental health tool. We teach different kinds of breathing to our patients at the hospital all the time. And so it's something that is easy to teach. It's also something we always have with us, right? If you talk about tools, you don't have to physically carry a book or carry, prayer beads with you. Your breath is already there. It's with you wherever you are. So it's an accessible tool that everybody has that we can use to deepen our spirituality and calm our minds and our bodies. So that's the background. I'm going to lead us through this practice a little bit today. I'm going to warn you ahead of time where we're going, just so that you're not taken off guard. We're going to start by just kind of checking in with our bodies and then noticing our breath, becoming aware, right, that consciousness, awareness of the breath. And then I'm going to invite you to come up with a word, a phrase, or an image for something that you would like more of in this moment, so that as you breathe in, you can imagine yourself breathing in that quality. It can be a name for God. right? It can be Jesus as you breathe in. I just want more Jesus in my life. It can be calm. It can be hope. Whatever it is that you feel like you need. It could be a visual image of something that you want more of in your life as you breathe in. And then we're going to do the same thing with the exhale. If there's something that you would like to let go of, to lift up to God, that is something that you can imagine in your exhale. Or perhaps if you're in a really strong emotional and spiritual state and you want to offer something out to the world, you can also do that on the exhale. Something that you want to either let go of and lift up to God or offer out into the world. So it could be, I want to let go of my worries, or I want to offer up love. Right? Any of those things. Again, a visual image is fine as well. And we're going to do that for probably about 3 minutes, which for some people is going to feel way too short, and for other people is going to feel way too long. So whichever one you are, just know that that's normal. And then we'll just check back in with our bodies again, and then I'll have some time for any observations you want to share, any comments that anybody has afterwards. So that is where we are going. And I invite you to have in mind, as we're doing this check-in at the beginning and the end, some of this idea of what's going on in our brains and in our bodies and our nervous systems. And see just what you notice, right? What's there that you might notice, and does anything shift? It might not, or maybe it does. So let's go ahead and begin. Find a comfortable seat. Allow yourself to be relaxed and supported in your chair. And just gently scan through your body, just noticing any physical sensations, thoughts, or emotions that might be there. And in that scan of your body, pay particular attention to your breath, to the fact that you are breathing in this moment. Noticing all the ways that your body is supporting your breath, the muscles that are moving, the way that your rib cage expands to make space for that breath. And as you're aware of your breath, identify that word or phrase of what you'd like more of in this moment. Whatever quality you'd like to breathe in, and begin to picture or repeat silently that quality with each inhale. I breathe in God's Spirit. I breathe in peace. I breathe in wholeness. And as you're ready, add on whatever you'd like to offer up with your exhale. Quality that you'd like to let go of, a prayer that you'd like to lift up to God, or a gift that you'd like to offer out into the world. I breathe in peace, and I let go of worry. I breathe in God's Spirit, and I offer God's love out to the world. And continue repeating those words or phrases or images with each breath in and each breath out. And we'll continue to do this in silence for a few more minutes. If at any point you feel distracted, that's okay. Just remind yourself to come back to your breath. Notice that you're breathing. Find those words or images. moment to notice your breath again. Feel your body breathing. And come back to that scan of your body, just checking in, noticing whatever's there. Noticing if anything feels different, the same. Ready, without rushing, start to blink open your eyes, come back to the room a little bit. And if anyone would like to share any observations, anything you noticed, or if you have questions about the practice,
I enjoyed it, actually. I'm in school for counseling, and I honestly despise this kind of work. I really don't like it, and I struggle in classes and stuff learning about it. I understand it, it could work, but for me it just never has. But that time when I actually, because a lot of the time my mind just wanders, and I can't get back, but actually saying something to myself and, repeating it over and over again really helped.
So for those who are watching online, the comment was about not always enjoying breath work or finding it easy to be distracted, but appreciating the prayerfulness and having words or phrases to stay grounded during the breathing. Anyone else?
I really liked the image of the 2 words. I don't know that I'd quite done that practice that way. And as we went on, the breathing inward got bigger and bigger, and the breathing outward got smaller and smaller in my mind. And that felt good.
So noticing that throughout the practice, the idea or the word with breathing in got bigger, and the breathing out became less of a focus. Other observations, questions?
Just an observation, I noticed that in coming back to the room, that breath that I took was more full and kind of refreshing than any other breath in the rhythm of that. So after that exercise, just the deep breath in was good.
Yeah, so becoming more aware of the breath, and after the practice, feeling the deeper breath, feeling the positive experience of breathing. I can share, go ahead.
I was just saying, say that the idea of hearing your voice and directing it and knowing that I'm doing this in a group was very supportive and helpful, rather than by yourself and keep that you're a lot alone.
Absolutely. So the idea of doing it in community, of having a guiding voice, but also knowing that you're not alone in the practice. And that I will get you, Carrie, but that relates exactly to what I was going to share, is that just observing. It's a little harder to be fully in the practice when I'm leading it in this way, but observing the room, there was kind of a settling in that happened after about 1 minute, where the energy in the room just got very smooth. And I was thinking about that idea of co-regulation and of being in community, and how our nervous systems all together were kind of settling in, and it was really beautiful. Carrie?
It reminded me a lot about a yoga practice that I learned from Melanie Parsons. I don't know if any of you took her yoga classes, but I think it's called Yoga Nidra, I think. But it's where with each breath you're concentrating on a particular part of your body, and you imagine the toxins leaving that, and then you imagine what's coming in with the breath is being held for oxygen.
Yeah, so the comment is this is very similar to certain types of yoga practices. Breath is a very important theme and tool in yogic traditions, which come from Hindu faith. And they have very many different types of breathing that are part of those traditions that have some parallels and some connections. And one thing that I found in my work as an interfaith chaplain, I am a Presbyterian minister, but I work with patients of all different faith traditions. And then learning and studying a lot of this is that although the theologies and the belief systems of different traditions are very different, many of the practices have a lot of overlap, especially the sort of contemplative prayer traditions and the sort of mystical strands of different religions have borrowed from each other a lot over the years. And I think breath prayer is definitely one of those. Because we all need to breathe, right?
What is a comment? I did this probably like a month ago now with you, and I really enjoyed it. But then I haven't been able to do it since because I haven't been in a group setting because my mind does wander very easily. That I haven't had that full. It's just easier to do in a group setting. Have you found that this is more of a group practice type prayer, or do you have any ways that you personally utilize this for yourself when you are alone?
Yeah, so the question is about finding it difficult, again, to continue practices like this individually on your own versus being in an organized group like this. I think there is always a great benefit to doing practices like this together. Breath prayer, I will say, is probably the one I do most by myself. I have experienced anxiety in my life, and breath prayer is one of the most effective tools that I've ever found to deal with it. I'm a person who lays down to try to sleep at night, and then my brain turns on, and that default mode network of rumination just goes in super fast gear. And so that having something to focus on, having the prayer to focus my mind while the breath is calming my body has been really helpful. So I do find it helpful individually, but I think each of us is also going to find our own sort of way through these practices. Whenever I talk about the book, I say the book is a toolbox. It's not meant to be a prescription or a curriculum. It's a bunch of different tools, and you try them out and you figure what works for you and take that with you. And so if group practice is what works for you, find a group that's doing this, right? Talk to me, we'll organize a group, right? Let's do this intentionally. All right, Miss Jackie, and then.
It's very sweet and very hard. And if you pray with me, you will be calm. I find that whenever you pray,
The comment is just how sweet and calming these prayer practices can be.
I just want to jump off on what Carrie was saying. I've done yoga classes in the past too, and the ones that were the most effective for me physically were the ones where we did the breathing exercises. We breathed in to a point, a part of our body, maybe it was bothering us, and then we breathed out the pain or the tension. And those were the most effective ones. And then the second thing is I go to a water aerobics class. My favorite one is with a woman who actually at the end of the class has us bring in a prayer and send it out to the world. A prayer for ourselves, a prayer for our family, a prayer for our nation. And because it's a community of people that I don't really know well, we've actually become closer friends by that simple activity. Sometimes we'll talk about what we've prayed for. And I've made friendships through a community activity.
Absolutely, right? And that when we engage in these practices with others, the relationships develop just by sharing in that goodwill, right? That offering prayers up for the world.
And then one third thing, just going back to the polyvagal theory, my medical doctor uses that because I don't know if anybody else in this room has white coat syndrome, but I do. As soon as I go in and I see the white coat, my blood pressure shoots right up. So he has me hold my fingers right here and do some deep breathing and then hum. And my blood pressure goes way down. And I feel much more relaxed. So at least my medical doctor has tapped into the usefulness of those kind of practices.
That's amazing. So for those who are watching online, it's a story of going to a medical doctor, having that white coat syndrome, your blood pressure rises just from being in the doctor's office, and having a doctor who has you tune into your heart rate, slowly breathe and hum, right? Tuning into that polyvagal theory to calm yourself as a medical practice.
You're going to stimulate your vagus nerve by doing these things.
It's so cool. I love that there's professionals in so many different fields connecting all of this information together.
I just want to make a comment. This is so normal when you're just starting that your mind goes all over. And so anybody who's teaching meditation is going to tell you, don't give up on it. Don't say, oh, this doesn't work for me. Keep practicing it. And so you're not going to run, a marathon next week, right? You're going to take years to kind of build up. And that's the same thing with meditation. Keep a focus on the word practice.
Yeah, so a reminder that these practices are practice, right? Comparing to training for a marathon or any other physical activity, that you don't jump in and do a 30-minute meditation on your first time, right? Just like I don't go out and run 36 miles the first time. So you have to build up your experience and start with little bits over time. I think this is a good time to transition into the next slide, which is about the implications. And I'm hoping to have some time for group discussion if we do. Yeah, I think we will. But I wanted to highlight what I think some of the implications are for faith communities of all of this research and all of these things that we've been doing together. So the first, and I think summary point, is that all of this research is really confirming what people of faith have already known, which is that engaging in our faith helps us, right? That we use it to get through difficult stuff in our life. And the difference is now we can see it happening in our brains, right? But it's not new information, right? There's centuries and centuries of wisdom from all different faith traditions about the importance of these kind of practices and the value of finding meaning and having a community and all of these different things. And then a piece related to that is the idea that active engagement with faith is what makes a difference, not just physically showing up, right? Some of that research about a body in a pew is not necessarily active engagement. It's not active coping, right? So the focus is more on how do we use our faith? How does our belief in God actually change our lives? Not just are we in the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. And then it's really important to remind ourselves that faith is not a cure for mental illness. Churches that have gone in that direction have caused a lot of harm by trying to pray away illnesses. Because what does that mean if you tried to pray it away and it's still there? What does that say about you and your relationship to God? And how harmful is that for people to feel like they prayed and it didn't work, right? So remembering that it's about using our faith to cope, not to cure. I think that's a really important point for churches to keep in mind. But that we can use it as an active resource, right? It is beneficial. It's not that religion is just over here and mental illness is over here. They can work together. They can be a helpful tool, but it's not a cure-all. And this idea of spiritual practices, as we were just saying, right? That it's just like physical well-being, right? Our exercise over time helps our physical well-being. Our spiritual practices over time help our mental well-being and our spiritual well-being. And what some of this research has shown us is that some ways of engaging our faith are more helpful than others, right? That there are ways in which faith can cause harm. That idea of positive versus negative coping. So compassion and forgiveness are really good for our brains. Judgment, not very good for our brains. Hope and meaning, right? Very positive for our brains. Things that give us a sense of despair, right? That example I just gave about if you pray your illness away and you still have the illness, that might lead you to despair pretty quickly. And that's not very good for our well-being. And then the idea of personal, intrinsic commitment to faith rather than just rote obedience, right? I just show up at church every Sunday because that's what I was told I was supposed to do, but I don't actually pay attention to what's being said, right? That's not actually doing much for our brains. Whereas if I'm actually sitting there listening and trying to think, how does this relate to my life? Or maybe I'm going and meeting with people from my community and talking about the things that I'm going through. That kind of personal engagement is what really makes a difference. And then I can't highlight enough the role of community, right? Being a part of a faith community or any kind of supportive community is so beneficial for our mental well-being versus spiritual beliefs that might lead towards more isolation. We talked about the sort of authoritarian rule-based view having kind of negative impacts. And I think for me, this is where, like, thinking about faith communities and young people and the role of mental health in adolescence today, how do we model this, right? What does it look like to teach and model this kind of active engagement? It's not just about, you come to church because I say so, right? How do we teach kids? How do we give them tools, right, that they can take with them into their lives for how to engage their faith? And that's what I get really passionate about. You know, my book is about spiritual practices. It's about things that we can do and try and do it together in community and talk about. And how do we as communities of faith teach that, but also model it, right? That study about the parents and children, right, is if we're sharing our faith, if we're modeling that when I go through something stressful, I'm talking about it through the lens of my faith and I'm engaging spiritual practices and my kids see me doing that. And then they can learn from that, right? It's not just about making sure they get to Sunday school on Sunday mornings. It's about modeling and sharing our faith together within our families. And again, highlighting again and again, community is one of the most important things that churches offer. There are very few organizations and places in our society that are intergenerational, where you have people of multiple generations gathering all together. And what wisdom is there in gathering that way, right? That people who've lived decades of life have a lot that they can teach and model to younger people. And younger people have different ideas and perspectives on the world that can be really healing for those of us who maybe got a little jaded along the way, right? And so being together in community in an intergenerational way is one of the most powerful things that I think faith communities can offer. And along with that is that reminder about being non-judgmental. Can we be a community that's welcoming, right? That allows people to be who they are and doesn't set unrealistic expectations. You can only join us if you dress a certain way or if you act a certain way. Can we just be together and let our nervous systems chill out together, right? How beautiful would that be? So I'm going to pause it there if there are any more questions, and if not, we're going to move into like some small group discussion with people who are sitting around you. But are there any other questions or comments for the group before we do that? So we'll go to our next slide, which has some discussion questions. So pick, 2 or 3 people sitting around you. I'm not going to be prescriptive about who you have to talk to, but some things to talk about. What stands out most to you personally from all this research? How will it inform, or how will the information change your personal spirituality? And then how might it impact your church or your faith community? So find a few people. We're just going to talk for 10 minutes. I know it's always awkward. We can do it, guys. And for those on the live stream, you can reflect on these questions on your own.
One of the reasons our church did that was back in the 80s,
How important it is, or like it might be like clear, of like I agree with the statements, like I actually not agree with the statement, and it might be something like a sliding scale of like these people identify as like self-identify as being very important to their day-to-day life, whereas this group doesn't, or like I'm not
for a long
I mean, it can just be like as I'm struggling or show that I'm getting this. Yeah, I'll just. All right, 2-minute warning. Finish up your conversations. All right, come on back. I love that it's hard to stop talking. This is great. Are there any new insights or questions that came out of your small group conversations that you want to share? Ms. Jackie.
Excuse me, I wasn't here in the very beginning, and I would like to ask you, sweetheart, it must be tedious at times when you get and so you turn it off and go home to your family. How do you cope with it inside of you? If there are a lot of, if someone gets really disrupted and you have to go and talk to them, you pray first and then talk, or and when you go home, looking at you, you're very intelligent young woman. I've watched you. When you go home, you must not turn it off, but you must say, God, here, I give it to you because I have to take care of my family now. Is that what you do, or do you think it's different?
Thank you. So the question is how I handle the stress of working at the hospital and kind of turning it off or lifting it up in prayer at the end of the day. And it's a little of everything. I often say that the hardest part of my job is not the patients. It's the system that gets in the way of caring for the people that I want to care for. So that is what I often bring home that I need to work on letting go. And things like this breath prayer. There have been times where I have to sit in the car for a minute before I go home and just pray, just breathe and let it out. And then having a good community of coworkers, a good faith community that supports me, is very, very important in my mental health along the way. So thank you. Other thoughts, questions, stories that you want to share from your small group?
Something that, like a new idea, like an element of the idea that came out of the discussion is that I was thinking about the idea of these practices as exercise, and even though it's something that I know that like continual reminder, that it's just something you need to do a little bit every day. You're not going to run a marathon tomorrow. So anyway, that's always really helpful for me to remember that. But as we were talking about that, Leanne mentioned the community aspect and talking about kind of the accountability buddy in that. And I think about the way you might have a gym buddy. It's like you would have a prayer buddy or somebody to check in. So I think that gym buddy aspect of it was helpful for me.
So the comment was about talking about these practices and comparing them to exercise, right, and needing to kind of hold ourselves accountable to keep doing it, and the value of community and accountability partners. And I will put a plug. The last chapter of my book is about soul friendship, which is an active accountability spiritual partner. That's what that practice actually is. And so you could do all the other practices within the context of that accountability person or small group as well. And so I definitely think that is something that has been passed down through our tradition, that it's helpful to have an accountability partner, right? Some people have a professional spiritual director that they go to who helps provide some of the support. Some people just have a Bible study group or a small group from their church that they get together and do these things with. So there's many different ways to get that accountability, but I very much agree. Accountability is very helpful.
A group of us have been doing it in our Bible study. We're going to be the last chapter is on Wednesday. We've gone through, and it's been so wonderful to go through each one together, talk about them. We always take time at the beginning to go back and people reflect on what they practiced, which ones they like, which ones are sticky, which ones don't necessarily work for them. But the insights of how other people are using them have been really helpful. It's been really a lovely study to do together.
Thank you. So Sarah is sharing about a Bible study group here at Pennington Presbyterian Church that has been using the book, and how valuable that discussion has been. Even if I don't find a practice meaningful, I hear how someone else is using it, and that can help me in my own reflection as well. So thank you. Yeah.
We briefly mentioned that we enjoy hearing about the science in the brain because, especially what resonated so much was, even if you have a predisposition for genetic mental illness, just like if you have a predisposition for heart disease, you're still in control of other aspects of your life that might make it not be as bad in your life as it might have been in a relative's life. So being crippled by fear that someone in my lineage has mental health, and so therefore it's going to be terrible for me, but being empowered that there are practices and things that we can do to ease even those genetically predisposed. I think that's helpful to hear the science.
Great. So the comment is about comparing genetic predisposition for mental health issues with other physical illnesses that have a genetic component that we can manage, that we can find skills, that we can find tools to make that illness less significant in our lives than it might have been for someone else. And that finding the research supporting the fact that spiritual practices can help us with that in terms of mental health issues.
I would quickly relate that to like generational trauma and stuff too.
Yes.
Now that we know this information, how can we help the next generation, and that involves that community aspect of that as well. So I'm always on the mindset of like, how can we help them, next generation? How can we help them be better? How can we help them learn? So I appreciate that.
Yeah, so a comment is comparing this also to the idea of intergenerational trauma, and that we can break that cycle of intergenerational trauma by sharing some of these tools and having the community support.
I just want to make a quick comment. If you haven't read the book, but my favorite part was the appendix to share all different ways that you could use the book. And I just want to thank you, Mary, for all the work that you put into this book and how exciting it is to have something like this. And have you. You're such a gifted speaker.
Thank you, Brenda. I will put my references up. I like to be held accountable that I didn't make up this information. I found it elsewhere. And then we do have copies of the book for sale. The church is selling copies of the book in the back, so if you don't already have one, they're $14.
Free signature.
Free signature if you want it. I'm here. So I know. Talk to Marcia; she'll sell it for me.
Thank you so much, Miriam. What a gift today has been. And thank you all for coming and for everything that you added to this great conversation and for where we're going to go next in our practices and connecting with God and working on our own well-being and trying to help as we do that to make a difference in the community around us. So thanks to everybody. There are refreshments over there, including some that are gluten-free. We hope there's something there for everybody. So stay and chat if you can. I'm also on that book table in the back. I'm going to just put a piece of paper. If you're interested in working with our science and faith team to come up with what our next projects might be, what are we interested in, I'll have a paper there and you can just give me contact information. We would love to have people, even beyond Pennington Presbyterian. I mean, we're together in this. So if you're interested in science and faith, you can put your name on the sheet. Thank you so much. And thanks to our tech team for helping the live stream. And thanks to live stream friends also. Thanks.
So fun.